Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Well, this hour, BC's Provincial Health Officer will give her review of the prescribed Safer Supply program in BC. We'll bring that to you live and ask for your thoughts. What impact has Safe Supply had on the toxic drug crisis? And a new Angus Reid poll finds many Canadians worry about losing their jobs and not having a financial cushion. Does that worry you? Could you manage a sudden change in your financial situation? First up, the province makes an historic apology in Castlegar. I'm Michelle Eliot. Welcome to BC Today. Thank you for joining us on CBC Radio 1 and CBC Television, live streaming as well on the CBC News app, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. In about an hour from now, the BC government is set to give an historic apology to the Doukhobor community. This is a religious community in the interior whose kids were forcibly removed from their parents in the 1950s. Attorney General Nikki Sharma has traveled to Castlegar to make the apology, coming up at 1 p.m. To tell us more, CBC's Brady Strachan joins me now. Hi, Brady.
Hi, Michelle.
Tell us what's behind this apology now from the province.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Many people are asking why now, because this community has been asking for an apology from the province for decades. And in fact, the BC Ombudsperson's Office released a report in the 90s demanding that the government issue an apology for the wrongs that the government inflicted on this community decades ago. That never happened. Last summer, BC's ombudsperson, who now, Jay Chalk, released another report, again, calling for an apology, an official apology from Victoria, as well as compensation for what happened to this religious community in the 50s. And the government did respond this time, announced that it would deliver an apology, and now we are seeing that happen starting today in Castlegar.
And can you take us through the history of this, Brady? What happened in the 1950s?
Yeah, this is a case of a religious sect from Russia that moved to the Kootenays called the Doukhobors. Specifically, this group is called the Sons of Freedom. And they didn't go along with what mainstream society at the time wanted for their children. They didn't want to have their children in public schools, and it was quite a battle between this community and the province. The Doukhobors protest. They protested nude. They burned their homes as a show that they didn't want to have material wealth, and there was also bombs that were set off. The province stepped in, seized about 200 children from families in the Kootenay area and put them into a school in New Denver. And there was a chain link fence. They were held there for about 6 years with very little opportunities to meet their parents. Survivors tell us that they would see their parents through the chain link fence a couple times a month, and that was the only physical contact they had with them. Now, I spoke with one survivor this summer, a man named Walter Schwetlikoff, who told me about his experiences. He's in his 70s now. He tried to evade police for years, and he used to sleep in an area like makeshift little cottages out in the woods because he knew that the RCMP were watching his home. And he did this for 2 years before he was finally caught when his family was trying to take him to the hospital for medical concerns. And he was finally seized and taken to this camp in New Denver. And he says this experience as a child of always being hunted and then stolen or taken from the parents has left him feeling lifelong anxiety. And he and others have been for many years asking for this apology and wanting the province to right this historical wrong.
And there's a lot of attention being paid to today's events. What can we expect throughout the day?
Attorney General Nikki Sharma is in Castlegar today. In less than an hour, she is going to issue an apology to survivors and their families. the ombudsperson estimates there are about 70 living survivors who were children that were seized. Then tomorrow, she will be in Grand Forks also to speak with survivors and their families, and then an official apology at the legislature in Victoria is also scheduled for later this month. But the one thing that we're unsure about is financial compensation directly to the survivors and their families. We'll wait and see what the apology lays out, but it seems that may not be coming. That's something that the ombudsperson called for just this summer, saying their families should be compensated. The living survivors now should be compensated. And if that aspect is not there, I expect that it may not be a completely satisfactory apology.
Well, we know that our Kootenay-based reporter, Corey Bullock, is in Castlegar traveling at the moment, and we'll have reaction from people there as well. Brady, thank you so much for your reporting on this.
Happy to do it. Thanks, Michelle.
That's the CBC's Brady Strachan joining us from Kelowna. It's 12:12 now, 1:12 in the Mountain Time Zone. This is BC Today here on CBC. And coming up in the next half hour of this program at about 12:30, the BC Provincial Health Officer is going to issue her review of the BC's Safer Supply Program, the Prescribed Safer Supply Program. We're going to have that for you live coming up in our next half hour. We're going to take your calls as well and ask you for your thoughts, ask you what impact you think that Safe Supply Program is having on the toxic drug crisis in our province. And someone who has been battling that toxic drug crisis since it was declared a public health emergency in April 2016 is BC's Chief Coroner, Lisa Lapointe. She's been on the forefront of that battle ever since. Now, Lapointe is set to retire on February 18th. She has seen multiple death review panels and has found almost 14,000 people have died in the last 8 years. Lapointe sat down with Gloria Makarenko on the early edition.
What we have learned, in fact, is that it is illicit fentanyl that is driving this crisis. We do keep an eye out very closely for any diverted prescribed medications, but 85% of those who die show evidence of illicit fentanyl, which the toxicologist can tell by the markers. And then we have seen other substances that really demonstrate how toxic the illicit market is. We've seen benzodiazepines increasingly, which make a medical response to a toxic event really, really challenging. We see cocaine, amphetamines, methamphetamines, extreme levels of fentanyl, carfentanil. So the ability for anybody using from the toxic illicit market to keep themselves safe it's virtually impossible now unless they are using drug checking services every time and being very, very cautious. And even then, we're seeing some deaths.
So now we move forward to where we are now, 2024. And in your last public appearance, you once again called for safer supply, to use non-prescription drugs. And a few days ago, we did hear the Premier, David Eby, speaking on this. He said he fundamentally disagrees with you on this. Why has this been such a difficult issue for the Premier to endorse, do you think?
It's been really interesting to see how the conversation has become polarized. So, as you mentioned at the outset, we've held 3 death review panels into the toxic drug crisis, which we do under the mandate of the Coroners Act. We bring together subject matter experts from a diversity of fields who have knowledge and expertise on this crisis. So, learned folks who have experience. And what they have said over and over and over is that we need to build an evidence-based treatment system. That has been consistent across all 3 panels. We need to have a continuum of care because people are at different stages. People who have not been using drugs for very long, maybe occasional use, to people who are heavily entrenched and wholly dependent on substances. So a continuum of care. And we also need to acknowledge that with over 200,000 people in our province using drugs, we cannot build that up fast enough to save lives. So while we build up that infrastructure, which is in its infancy, safer supply, prescribed ideally, but in a climate where we have 1 million people in BC without a family doctor, the capacity for prescribed safer supply has been very, very challenged. And in fact, what we've seen is the ability to access safer supply has decreased over the last couple of years.
That's BC's outgoing Chief Coroner, Lisa Lapointe. And coming up, as I mentioned, in about 15 minutes from now, Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry will speak about her review of the prescribed safer supply program in BC. We'll bring that to you live, and we'll take your calls as well, your reaction to what you hear from Dr. Bonnie Henry. And we're asking you what impact you think the prescribed safer supply program has had on the toxic drug crisis. It's 12:16, 1:16 in the Mountain Time Zone. You're with BC Today. Now, if you're looking to do some skiing today, you're perhaps out of luck. Things look pretty bare on local hills. Cypress Mountain and Mount Washington on the island shut down both their downhill and cross-country ski areas. Mount Seymour and Grouse Mountain also closed for downhill activities due to lack of snow. Sun Peaks, though, in the interior is open. Now, it has been a rough season for skiers and boarders out there. The CBC went to Mount Seymour and caught up with ski buffs Riyad Abulaban and Carol Shaven.
Yeah, it's a bad season. I mean, I haven't seen anything like this for decades. And the snow, I mean, you know, in the backcountry, it's really bad as well because the snowpack is completely saturated with water. It's pretty unsafe and there's not much coverage. So I don't know. I think for everybody that loves the outdoors and the mountains, it's kind of a year of just being cautious. It's a bummer year. It's just getting out when we can, and even when it's raining. I mean, the freezing level is so high right now, but well, it's pretty sad. It's hard to see because, you know, these are small businesses, especially Seymour is kind of family owned, and it's a tough year. It's a tough time for everybody in the ski industry, I think.
Now, that didn't stop the pair, though. Instead, they went snowshoeing. If you're watching that, you would have seen just how bare the trails were behind them. You could see the snow, but really see the ground coming up from underneath there. We'd love to get your emails on this. If you are an avid skier or snowboarder yourself, what has been the season like for you? Have you made a trip to the mountains lately? Let us know what those conditions were like. You can email us bctoday@cbc.ca. Well, there are continued signs of economic uncertainty for Canada. We're asking you, are you concerned about job loss in the next 6 months? Would you be prepared for a sudden change in your finances? You can give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733 on your cell phone, pound 690. And this morning, Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, addressed the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. He said that they think the monetary policy is working to reduce inflation, but that it is still too high. And they're currently working on debating whether that monetary policy is restrictive enough. Now, that financial uncertainty also translates to everyday Canadians, too. A new Angus Reid poll shows that half of Canadians under 55 worry that they will be impacted by job loss because of the uncertainty. And a majority of them would not be able to cover an unexpected expense of more than $1,000 in the next month. We'd love to hear from you. Is that something that concerns you, that economic uncertainty, what it means for your job security? And would you be able to withstand an unexpected change in your financial situation? You can give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733 on your cell phone, pound 690. If you'd like to email us, it's bctoday@cbc.ca. My guest is John Rowe, a research associate with Angus Reid Institute, and he joins me now. Hello, John.
Hi, Michelle.
Thanks so much for joining us. What was the purpose of this study?
Well, we tend to take a look at economic factors every once in a while just to kind of keep tabs on how the economy is going and how Canadians are feeling about their finances and whether or not they have kind of concerns or stresses about the economy. So we kind of undertake these polls once a quarter or so at least. And we have a couple questions that we tend to ask fairly regularly, including, are you worried that you or someone else in your household are worried about job loss in the future, or if the economy turns? And how much money, say, if you had an unexpected expense, could you handle in a situation? Would you be kind of able to handle something of $1,000, $500, $250, those kind of things?
Hmm. And when it comes to employment, we know about the economic uncertainty, but we also hear about relatively low unemployment, workforce shortage. Why are people concerned about their own job security?
Yeah, that's been kind of the interesting thing the last couple of years is that we have had these kind of historic levels of employment where there hasn't really been this sort of unemployment that we've seen typically. And Canadians were still somewhat afraid of losing their job. So I think it kind of speaks that there is always kind of a fear in the back of people's heads that maybe they could lose their job, maybe the economy is going to turn at some point. But we do see that number has kind of elevated in our most recent data. So overall, it's about 42% of Canadians say that they're worried that they or someone else in their household could lose their job if the economy turns. But I think most importantly, it's those under 55s. It's about 50% of Canadians under 55 who say, "Oh yeah, I'm worried about that." And I think that kind of speaks to that fear has kind of permeated a lot more into the working age population.
Mm. Uh, what did you find in BC when it came to those numbers?
Well, BC is actually a little bit higher than elsewhere in the country. So it's about 48% of people in BC who say that they're worried about this. And with the national average being about 42%, it is a bit more elevated in BC. And I think maybe there are some more concerns about the BC economy, I guess, going into the future than there are in other places across the country. I know I'm based in Alberta, and I think Alberta is kind of projected to have higher economic growth than other provinces. So Canadians maybe factor that into that as well. But as we kind of looked at it, even in the last couple of years, there were people that were worried about losing their jobs despite the low unemployment. So it does kind of, I think, play into maybe their own personal situations, depending on what type of jobs they have as well.
Right. You actually looked at that, the different types of jobs that people were in and who was concerned. What did you find there?
We didn't actually kind of sort that out by different types of jobs, but we do have that kind of by like income level in some different ways. So I think like if you're in a kind of more, I guess, like a service industry role or working at a restaurant, lower income jobs, those I think are always kind of at more risk, I think, than some of the more I guess white collar jobs, I guess.
Mm.
And I think that kind of plays into it as well too. If you're in a position where you are not necessarily kind of full time, you're on a part time job, you're working shift to shift, or you're getting your shifts every week, then maybe that would kind of play into your fears as well.
Okay. We've had various conversations over the last few months about artificial intelligence. It strikes me that that's something that's come up in labor disputes, the role of AI and what impact that has on people's job, employment futures. Did that come up at all?
Well, it's something that we've been thinking about polling for a while because that
Mm.
has been part of the discussion. It's not something we've asked about specifically, but I think that does tend to play into people's minds. Like I've had conversations with my friends who work in
Right.
different types of jobs,
Yeah.
and it's just like, oh, I'm a writer, or I'm like even like if you're like a photographer and things like that, where it's like, oh, maybe in 2 years, if the AI technology is good enough, maybe there won't be as much need for these types of creative jobs, and like what will those jobs look like in the future? So I think that certainly has to play a role in how Canadians look into the future and whether or not that job that they're currently working is going to be there.
Yeah. So there's no matter what, there is that sort of tentativeness about employment in the future. The other part of what you looked at was financial security and how secure people felt, and how confident they were in being able to cushion themselves should things change. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so we asked Canadians how large of a one-time expense could you manage this month, and giving them a range of different numbers. So it's about 2 in 5 Canadians that say they could handle anything over $1,000, but below that, it's between like 30% that say it's between $500 and $1,000, 16% that say it's between 100 and 250, and then there's 15% of Canadians who say I couldn't handle any unexpected expense. I'm
Mm.
already too stretched. So it does, like, there are a lot of Canadians. I think like $1,000 seems like a good threshold because I mean, yeah, if like say a sudden car repair came up, maybe an appliance in your house broke down or something like that, where you would need to have it fixed right away. There are a lot of Canadians where if that expense was $1,000 or more, they wouldn't be able to handle it. It's about a majority of Canadians that say that.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from our audience as well. Is that something that does weigh on you? You know, your economic stability, job security in the coming months, given economic uncertainty. And when you think about your financial situation, your budget, the increased cost of living, really that affects everything, would you be able to withstand an unexpected cost? You can give us a call, 1 800 825 5950 604 669 3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. By email is bctoday@cbc.ca. And let me ask you then, my guest here, John Rowe, Research Associate with the Angus Reid Institute, what about interest rates? What impact has that been having then on people's savings?
Well, I think what we see is that Canadians who are renters, who I think are affected by interest rates, because typically when their owner's mortgage goes up, they have to pay more to rent, as well as owners with a mortgage. What we've seen over the last couple years is kind of taking data while this inflation crisis has kind of taken hold. Renters and owners with a mortgage, they're suffering quite a bit as these kind of interest rates have gone up. And we see that as well when we come to this question about, okay, how much of a one-time expense you can handle. Owners who paid off their mortgages, it's a majority who say they can handle over $1,000. So they have a lot of kind of cushion to kind of take care of any sudden expenses. Renters and people with a mortgage, it's a lot less. It's about 30% of renters and about maybe 36% of owners with a mortgage who are able to handle more than $1,000. So we see how kind of those high interest rates, those high mortgage payments, those high rents have kind of impacted people's financial cushions.
Well, we have a caller on the line from the West Kootenay. Daryl is joining us from Montrose. How does this affect you or perhaps your kids, Daryl?
Well, what I find myself, I'm 70 years old. And the reason I called is talking about $1,000 if a person needs that. My money's tied up in RSPs, and it takes me about a month to get some out if I should need it. Hopefully, I shouldn't have to. But the point is, if a person needs that grant, but I've got children living at home here. I got a daughter and her husband. They're scrimping to save up enough money for a down payment, and they can't buy something for under $500,000. And I got two other sons living at home with me because of their situation. We've all pooled and we get through everything. Bills are paid. But the point is, like with me, I'm 7 years old, and we can't go on strike. This year they're talking about giving us a 0.4% increase. It's not even the cost of living.
In pension.
In pension, yeah. And so that means that we're falling behind. And we built this country. We deserve better than that.
The cost of living affecting pensioners. And you have then, it sounds like 3 sons living with you, right?
2 sons and a daughter.
2 sons and a daughter.
And her husband.
Yes, and all because it's about trying to afford perhaps a down payment. And we know prices going up in the Kootenays as well.
Well, yeah, there's a couple of houses right around me. They're $499,000. Wow. You know, it's become to the point where you're not going to have a house in your lifetime.
Daryl, thank you so much for sharing your situation there. I understand it's quite disheartening as you talk about it. It's affecting generations, isn't it? And here we have people living together because the children cannot afford to purchase their own home, and pensions not keeping up with the cost of inflation. How much is that? It's perhaps not about job security, but even not feeling like you can catch up to the cost of living. How much is that a concern? I don't know if that was something that came up in your polling this time around, John.
Well, this is a question that we kind of started asking as this kind of inflation has taken hold, and it's do you feel like you can keep up to the rising cost of living? And it's about 3 in 5 Canadians that say that they feel like they're falling behind. And it kind of speaks to, I think, what Daryl was saying, is that a lot of people are living on fixed income, or they don't have a house, so they don't have kind of that stability to kind of build towards, and they're trying to save for down payments. But meanwhile, your rent is increasing, groceries are becoming so expensive. And all these things kind of eat away at your kind of finances. And as kind of Daryl points out as well, with that kind of only a small percentage raise in your pension, well, like a lot of Canadians are getting raises and those kind of things either. So as it kind of compounds, then you're feeling like, okay, like I'm falling behind, even though it's kind of difficult, I think, to kind of keep up ahead. And we found that, it's about 3 in 5 Canadians that feel that they're falling behind because of this rising cost of living.
John, thank you so much for chatting with us about this afternoon. Good to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
John Rowe is a research associate with the Angus Reid Institute. You're with BC Today here on CBC, and coming up in our next half hour, we'll bring you live a news conference with Dr. Bonnie Henry speaking about the prescribed Safer Supply program in BC. Right now, it's 12:31, time for a CBC News update, and here's Belle Puri.
Good afternoon. Protesters with Palestinian flags have set up blockades at 2 entry points to the Port of Vancouver. All vehicle access has been blocked. Buses have had to detour. The group, Independent Jewish Voices, says it wants the federal government to block all shipments to Israel. Vancouver Police is monitoring the situation. Residential development projects are increasingly being pushed into receivership due to high interest rates, construction costs, and a slower real estate market. In Vancouver, creditors have filed for receivership on a planned 55-story downtown condo. Banks say high-rises are especially prone to challenges that face residential projects. And the BC government has launched a review of its Labour Relations Code. A 3-member panel has until May 31st to recommend if any changes are needed. The panel will talk to interest groups and look at labour codes in other jurisdictions. It has been 4 years since the BC Code was last reviewed. A look at the BC weather along the north coast. Rain late this afternoon, a high of 8 degrees. In the Peace region, mainly cloudy, about 8 degrees there as well. For the central interior, it will be mainly cloudy and up to 11 degrees. In the southeast, showers in 3. Southern interior, periods of rain and 8 degrees. Along the south coast, Greater Victoria, Metro Vancouver, mainly cloudy with a chance of showers. The temperature steady around 11 degrees. That's the CBC News from Vancouver.
We were talking about ski hills and the sort of bare conditions on those runs right now. A lot of the local mountains closed. Sun Peaks is open, though. Have you tried heading up to a mountain lately? Or?
I have not. I'm not a skier.
Me neither.
I love to, look at it. But you're absolutely right. I remember, just a couple of days ago when it was a little bit of sun came out and looking at the mountains thinking, how they look great. And then I realized, well, wait a minute. There's not very much snow up there.
Not very much, yeah. No. And I do like to go for hikes and things like that. So for me, I'm okay with not a lot of snow. But we were talking about things being closed. Joanna actually wrote us and said, I pulled over to email you on my way down from Sovereign Lake Nordic Center on Silver Star Mountain. Only the inner trails are groomed, but the skiing was good.
Oh, well, that's good. But yes, they've been closed here and closed, around
on the
Washington.
Island, yes.
So, but I think, we're just first day of February, so there's a few more weeks. Maybe you can still get in some of your alpine activities.
Alpine activities. I love it. Looking at the glass half full, Belle.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great to hear from you. That's CBC's Belle Puri from the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us on CBC Radio 1, live streaming as well on the CBC News app. And we have some more emails for you. We talked about rent yesterday as well. Someone is emailing us. Sandra wrote, please talk about the SAFER program. It helps low-income renters with rent, but the problem is they won't raise their rental subsidy. The maximum is $743 per month for a one-bedroom. And that's when a bedroom in Chilliwack is $1,700 per month for a one-bedroom. Sandra, thank you very much for that. This is BC Today. Well, this hour, Dr. Bonnie Henry is releasing a review of the prescribed Safer Supply program in BC. We're going to go to it in just a moment. Let us know as well. We'd love to hear from you on the open line, what your thoughts are on what you hear from her. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. What impact has the province's Safe Supply program had on the toxic drug crisis? Right now, let's go live to Vancouver and Dr. Bonnie Henry.
In the report, which is now posted publicly, and I encourage people to have a look at that, there are 4 parts to it. One is the report that I've done, the recommendations. A second part of it is an engagement report, basically what we heard, and that is the stories and the voices of the clinicians, people who use drugs, their family and supporters. And as you can tell from that report, there are very important stories and voices there, and they are varied. There were many things that we heard from many different groups of people, and there was not one unified voice around this program. There was, in many places, some conflict between different groups of clinicians as well. There's an evidence scan included in the report, and that was conducted primarily by the BC Centre on Substance Use, and Dr. Crabtree is going to speak to what some of the key highlights from that. And there was an ethics review from a public health perspective, and that's very important. How we look at things from a population basis is quite different from the questions that we as clinicians have when we talk to an individual. We look at benefits and harms accruing to an individual, and we have Dr. Varani to talk to that. I just want to situate as well, when we took on this review, the recommendations that came out of this support what I believe and what I am wedded to, which is a public health approach. And what does that mean? That means we attempt as best we can to respect the autonomy and right to self-determination of people who use drugs. We want to support healthcare providers and others who care for people who use drugs. And we need to address the underlying determinants of health. Things like stigma and shame, discrimination and racism, particularly, that lead to health inequities experienced by people who use drugs. It also needs to be informed by people with lived and living experience and be, as I call it, pragmatic and evidence-based. And I'm just going to talk about that for a minute. That really is acknowledging that we have imperfect scientific evidence. But evidence alone, and you've heard me say this many times during the pandemic, evidence alone never tells you what to do. It has to be put in the context and understanding of what's happening in the community and in the areas around the evidence. So to guide decision making, we can't rely on evidence alone. We have to be pragmatic as well, bridging that gap when there is not sure scientific evidence, and the gap between that and practical application. And again, focusing on minimizing harms and maximizing benefits of any decision that we make. So what that means is that we use evidence to inform the decision, and we consider a wide range of evidence sources, from research studies, which are important, from systematic reviews, local data, understanding what's happening in local areas, the professional experience that we heard from people across the province, but also taking into account the knowledge base that we hear from First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities in this province, and the wisdom that comes from Indigenous knowledge. Linked people from understanding the evidence from lived and living experience, and from a broad stakeholder perspective. And all of this informs the decision making and shapes the recommendations that are in my report. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Crabtree, and she's going to give you a summary of what we heard from the evidence perspective.
Thanks so much, Dr. Henry. So I've been asked to share what we know and what we don't know about the impacts of the prescribed safer supply policy. I want to preface this summary by saying that there is substantial evidence about other things that will help people who use drugs. The evidence base on prescribed safer supply as a policy is growing. We also have a large evidence base to grow on to build on interventions across the spectrum of supports for people who use substances: prevention, early intervention, treatment and recovery, and harm reduction. And it's important in talking about the evidence around prescribed safer supply to not forget that we need to serve people who use drugs across that whole spectrum. I also want to start off by acknowledging that the way research evidence grows is really tightly connected to lines of power in our society. And we know that research has been a part of how colonialism is enacted against Indigenous people, and it's important to acknowledge that what counts as research is based on who has power. So when we attend to research, we should also be attending to making sure that the voices of people who use substances and
Right now, you're
Indigenous
listening to
people are
Dr. Alexis Crabtree from the BC Centre for Disease Control, and as well, Dr. Bonnie Henry, previous to her. They are releasing their findings on the Safer Supply program in BC and how it has been working, and they have issued some recommendations as well. We're going to hear that from the Provincial Health Officer as she speaks and returns to speak. We're asking you as well, do you think the Safe Supply program is working in BC? What impact has it had on the toxic drug crisis in this province? Love to hear from you. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone as well. Let's go back live now to the press conference.
We found a fraction of those people are accessing opioid prescribed safer supply. At the time the report was written, only 4,331 people accessed opioid prescribed safer supply in that month. It's important to note we've seen a decrease in prescribing of opioid prescribed safer supply each month since April. In the latest data we have available is from November, and in November there were 4,265 people receiving opioid prescribed safer supply. 4,331 of 15,000 people is less than 4% of people with an opioid use disorder accessing prescribed safer supply in a given month. You might be wondering, how does that compare to people who have received opioid agonist therapy? And the answer to that is about 21% of that 115,000 people receive opioid agonist therapy in a given month. In addition to how many people are accessing prescribed safer supply, it's important to know who is accessing prescribed safer supply. And what we know about this is that it is people who are connected to care, and for the very most part, people who have a previous diagnosis of opioid use disorder. Although the policy as written means that people who access illegal opioids but do not have an opioid use disorder would be eligible under the policy, in practice, what we see is that the vast majority of people who are accessing opioid prescribed safer supply have a past diagnosis of opioid use disorder. That's important because we do know that there are people who are accessing the unregulated supply who would not meet criteria for an opioid use disorder, and it appears that their access to prescribed safer supply is very, very limited. Next, I'll talk about outcomes for people who are accessing prescribed safer supply. This is new, and so the body of evidence around it is growing. There's a lot more that we still need to learn about outcomes. I would summarize what we know about outcomes by saying that the evidence shows that this is promising, but there's not yet strong enough research to say that this is an evidence-based intervention. There's been some qualitative research conducted with people receiving prescribed safer supply, and also quantitative research using people's medical records to assess their outcomes. The research is largely positive about prescribed safer supply. However, this research and Dr. Henry's consultations clearly show that hydromorphone tablets, which is the main substance that people are accessing via the policy, is not a substance that is working for everyone. Some of the outcomes identified by researchers associated with receiving prescribed safer supply are a reduction in the rate of drug poisoning events, greater connection to wellness and care, decreased reliance on the unregulated market, and enhanced connection to wraparound services. But understanding the role of prescribed safer supply in these outcomes is really difficult, because accessing prescribed safer supply means being connected to a clinician and receiving medical care. It's quite tough to identify what is the specific contribution of the prescribed safer supply medications as opposed to the contribution of receiving medical care, prescription for opioid agonist therapy, which often occur alongside prescribed safer supply, and other factors that are happening at the same time for people. And that's why it's really important to have high quality studies that include a control group, that include people who are very similar to people receiving prescribed safer supply but did not receive prescribed safer supply. As this evidence base develops, we need more evidence in a couple of domains particularly. We need more evidence about how well prescribed safer supply programs keep people engaged in care over time, otherwise known as retention. And we need more evidence about prescribed safer supply in the last couple of years. The evidence base that is starting to grow is based on early experiences of prescribed safer supply, 2020, 2021, 2022. And as we move out of the pandemic, we know that the situation is different, and we need to keep researching and investigating how prescribed safer supply is impacting people now. The last topic I want to cover is what we know and what we don't know about unintended consequences. The intended consequence of the prescribed safer supply policy is to reduce deaths from drug poisoning. It's also possible that there are unintended consequences of a policy like this. We need to be open to researching those potential unintended consequences when they are raised. The unintended consequence that people are most concerned about is diversion of the medications. I would summarize what we know about unintended consequences by saying, although what is available is reassuring, the evidence base around unintended consequences is very limited. We know from qualitative research about patients who have accessed prescribed safer supply that some of them do share or sell their medications, particularly when they feel those medications don't act as an adequate substitute to the unregulated drug supply. The research suggests they have a variety of reasons for doing that, and some of the motivations include supporting others who might not have access to prescribed safer supply and other unmet needs in their own lives, and Dr. Virani will speak more about how that came out in the ethics analysis. BC Coroner Service investigates all drug poisoning deaths in BC.
That is Dr. Alexis Crabtree with the BC Centre for Disease Control, and she was providing there some of what they have found when it comes to the outcomes for people who have accessed the prescribed safer supply program in BC. Some of what she said is that there's a lot more that we still need to learn. Evidence shows that it is promising, but it's not yet strong enough research to show that it is evidence-based. And research is largely positive about prescribed safer supply, but the hydromorphone tablets, which are the main substance prescribed, as she pointed out, doesn't work for everyone. They have found a reduction in deaths and enhanced connection to wraparound services, trying to determine, though, what factor is contributing most to that, she said, was hard to identify, whether it was the prescribed safer supply program or other factors that were happening at the same time. And she also just talked about unintended consequences, and she said that we need to be open to researching those. What she talked about was the concerns around diversion of the medications that are being prescribed. Although she says, although what is available is reassuring, there is evidence, the evidence base around that diversion or those unintended consequences is very limited. And she says that we do know that some people do share or sell their medications. So that from BC Centre for Disease Control, live right now from Vancouver as the Provincial Health Officer releases her review of BC's Safer Supply Program. We're asking you, is it working? What impact is it having on the toxic drug crisis in your view? You can give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 as well on your cell phone. Neil is joining us from Nanaimo. Hi, Neil.
Hi.
Welcome. What are your thoughts on what you're hearing?
Well, I don't agree with very much of it right at this point because, new studies, how many years are we going to study this when people 7 a day right here? I think that one point was made. Yes, the people might be selling their safe supply to get the they want. Now, if we give them what they want, besides the fact that them safe supply that they get is going to be helpful to someone else that needs a safe supply, give the people what they want. They won't be going out stealing all the time. That makes our streets safer, or at least safer feeling, because you don't have these people that aren't getting the right medication, stealing, and disregarding everybody else to get it.
What do we know about that connection, though, between theft and, that does contribute to that sort of public concern around public safety?
Yes. We also got to remember a majority of these people are dying alone in their houses without the proper medications.
Neil, can you tell me a little bit about what brings you to this conversation?
What brings me, just seeing in Nanaimo, seeing these poor people laying on the sidewalk all day long that need help. Like they're really in a sad state. It's driving people away from the area where they are congregating, which is a sickness on society. It's making other people ill that aren't even involved in it because they're uncomfortable now. And uncomfortable, unsafe feelings dwell in you and hurt you. And if the streets are safe, by giving these people the drugs they need so that they can move on, not be breaking stores up and making havoc, basically, it would be a good thing, I think.
Neil, thank you very much for the call from Nanaimo. And the point was made there that the hydromorphone tablets don't always work for everyone. And I think that was part of your point there. That's Neil calling us from Nanaimo, taking your calls on this as well, asking you, do you think the Safer Supply program is working as it is? And what impact is it having on the toxic drug crisis? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. By email, bctoday@cbc.ca is where you can reach us. And we're going to go to another call in a moment. But right now, let's go back live to the press conference. And right now, they're continuing to speak. And this is Dr. Alice Varani.
Many different people, diverse people, around their experience and their considerations around ethical issues related to prescribed safer supply. So, of course, we talked to people who use drugs and who are most impacted by the unregulated drug supply. We talked to healthcare providers. We talked to people working with youth. We talked to peers. We talked to family members. And I'm very grateful for those people who shared their voices and shared their stories, some of which were devastating and some of which will stick with me for a very, very long time. So when we had this discussion, what did we learn? Well, we learned about some of the benefits of prescribed safer supply, and that really for some people it is life-saving and life-changing, and that really supports dignity, self-determination, and will allow people to really, get their life back. I have very clear voice in my head of a woman I spoke to from northern BC who said, your prescribed safer supply has allowed me to get up in the morning, have my shower, go to work, care for my family members, and it has changed and turned my life around, and that voice will stick with me for a long time. We did, however, hear some concerns in relation to prescribed safer supply. We heard a lot of concerns that there's not enough access to prescribed safer supply. We had concerns that what is being prescribed isn't necessarily meeting people's needs. We had concerns related to youth, those from rural and remote communities. And then we heard a lot of concerns related to the disproportionate impact of the unregulated drug supply on Indigenous peoples. And that was a really important voice to be heard, and I hope will carry through in some of the other areas of the analysis, which I will move on to now. We also, as Dr. Crabtree mentioned, spent a fair amount of time talking to folks about diversion. And one of the questions in our ethical analysis focuses on diversion in particular. And I think the important thing to know about our engagement is we heard about both the benefits of diversion and the harms, potential harms of diversion. And I think the core takeaway for me from hearing from people about diversion is that diversion in and of itself isn't something we should think of as good or bad. Diversion is something we should think of as in terms of its unmet needs. So diversion happens because people's needs are not being met in other ways. So I mentioned that we we take a public health ethics approach, and we have ethical values and principles which are very established in the literature, and we use to help guide us through working through public health ethics issues. Public health is different from clinical ethics in that it looks at populations, and it looks at risks and benefits of interventions on a population as a whole, and how different groups within a population might be differentially impacted by different interventions, as opposed to clinical ethics, which really looks at individuals and the impact of interventions and risk and benefits on a specific individual. So we need to take that broader framework. So we look at procedural justice, which is how we make decisions and how we work together, and then substantive values, which is what goals and ends are we trying to pursue, and how do we weigh values and principles against each other. And one of the biggest kind of hopefully self-evident things that we're trying to do here, and Dr. Crabtree talked about as well, is decrease deaths from the unregulated drug supply. So we looked at 4 questions. The first one was really, how should we balance the real and potential benefits and harms of prescribed safer supply? And after looking at what we heard during the engagement and looking at our ethical principles and values, what we landed on, and you'll see in our analysis, was that safer supply is currently an ethically defensible way to reduce harms for people who use drugs. And the important thing here from an ethics perspective is that it's reasonable to attempt to mitigate harms for individuals who face certain and severe harm. We know that 7 people per day are dying from the unregulated drug supply in BC, and that we have to choose and look at interventions to prevent these certain and severe harms, even if there is some risk of harm to others in the broader population.
You've been listening to Dr. Alice Varani of the Provincial Health Services Authority, and her statement there saying safe supply is an ethically defensible way to reduce harms for people who use drugs. That press conference is continuing, and you can continue to watch it on our website, cbc.ca/BC, and much more coverage throughout the day from Dr. Bonnie Henry's findings and her review of BC's Safer Supply Program.